The courthouse lawn was still wet from the night before. Aldrich Webb stood on the steps and did not move. Not because he was devastated, not because he was angry, because he was taking inventory. The way a surgeon takes inventory before a procedure, calm, systematic, starting with what is present and working toward what is not. The house was gone. The savings account he had built dollar by dollar across 11 years of double shifts and missed dinners, and the quiet loneliness of being married to someone who had already decided to leave, but hadn't said so yet. Gone. The car gone. The community clinic on Farwell Avenue that he had opened 6 years ago, with a folding table and a secondhand blood pressure cuff, and the stubborn conviction that someone had to serve the people the hospital system had quietly decided weren't worth the trouble. Gone. Folded into the settlement like a coupon. Like something with no more value than the paper it was printed on. Simone Tharp stood on the landing 2 steps above him with Preston Lowe at her elbow. Preston was in a charcoal suit that cost more than Aldrich's first car. He was holding a leather portfolio and looking at his phone and doing an excellent job of pretending that none of this was personal. Aldrich looked at Simone for 1 second. Then he looked away. He had one thing left. The judge had said so clearly in that flat judicial tone that treated the pieces of a human life the way an auctioneer treats furniture. Primary residential custody. Nadia, 11 years old, already too smart for the world she was growing up in. Already watching adults with that quiet, measuring gaze that told you she was keeping a ledger somewhere and that one day she would present it. He held that fact in his chest like the last ember in a burned-down house. Then he reached into his coat pocket for his car keys and stopped. Right. No car. He stood there on the courthouse steps in Atlanta in October with his hand in an empty pocket, and the faint absurdity of the moment settled over him like weather. 41 years old, board-certified surgeon, father, standing on a public sidewalk trying to figure out how to get to the apartment he had been renting since March, with nothing but a messenger bag and the clothes on his back. He started walking. He made it approximately 30 feet. That was when the sound hit him. A deep, rhythmic thudding from somewhere above and behind, low and insistent, getting louder fast. Several people on the courthouse steps looked up. A few stepped back. Someone grabbed a child's arm on reflex, the way parents do when something unexpected and large moves through their airspace without warning. A helicopter. Black. Significant. The kind of aircraft that did not land on courthouse lawns by accident or coincidence, or any reason other than someone had decided it would land there, and the world had rearranged itself to accommodate that decision. The hull was marked in silver lettering, clean and precise. Ashford Air Medical. It settled onto the grass with the certainty of something that had done this before and expected to do it again. The door opened. A woman in a charcoal suit stepped out. Not Preston's charcoal, something different entirely. The kind of charcoal that comes from knowing exactly what you are doing and having dressed for it every day for several decades. She was in her mid-50s. She moved across the courthouse lawn with the economy of someone who had not wasted a step in a very long time. She walked directly toward Aldrich, stopped 2 feet in front of him, and looked at him. "Dr. Webb." Her voice was even, not warm, not cold, precise. The voice of a woman who had learned long ago that clarity was its own form of respect. "My name is Diana Ashford. I need you to help me save lives, and I need you to start today." Aldrich looked at the helicopter, looked at her, said nothing for 3 full seconds. On the steps above them, he was aware without looking directly that Simone had stopped moving, that Preston Lowe had looked up from his phone, that Preston's face had gone very carefully neutral, in the way faces go neutral when a person is managing information rather than receiving it. Not surprised, not curious, processing, calculating, running numbers on something he had not expected to need to run numbers on this morning. The deliberate flatness of a man who already knew how this scene was supposed to go and was now watching one variable arrive slightly ahead of schedule. Aldrich filed that away. He almost laughed. He almost turned around and walked back to the sidewalk and kept going toward the bus stop 6 blocks east and figured out the rest from there. But Nadia had asked him something that morning over cereal, in the careful voice of an 11-year-old who has learned that certain questions need to be asked quietly so the answer doesn't feel like it has to be loud. She had asked him whether things were going to be okay. He had said yes. He had no idea how to make that true. He picked up his messenger bag. He followed Diana Ashford across the courthouse lawn to the helicopter. He did not look back at the steps, not at Simone, not at Preston Lowe, not once. The interior of the helicopter was not what he expected. He had expected corporate chrome and leather in the quiet performance of expensive things. What he found was functional to the point of austerity. Medical equipment mounted in precise configurations along the walls, a communications panel, a jump seat, the smell of antiseptic and recycled air, and something faintly mechanical that reminded him unexpectedly of OR prep rooms at 6 in the morning. Diana sat across from him as the aircraft lifted. She did not wait for him to settle. Ashford Air Medical operates 31 transport helicopters, she said. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee. Rural coverage. Underserved regions. Places where the nearest trauma center is 45 minutes by road, and the difference between someone living and dying is what happens in the first 12 minutes of transport. She looked at him, not at the window at him. In the past 2 years, we have lost 11 patients during transport. Not because of equipment failure, not because response times were slow, because the emergency protocols our medical staff use in the air were designed for hospital floors. And a hospital floor and the back of a moving helicopter are not the same environment. Aldrich said nothing. In a hospital, you have space, stability, relative quiet, time measured in minutes rather than seconds. In the air, you have 18 inches of lateral clearance, constant vibration that affects both the patient's physiology and the clinician's fine motor control, rotor noise that makes verbal communication unreliable, and pressure changes that alter the way medications behave in the bloodstream. She folded her hands in her lap, not nervously, the way a person folds their hands when they are being precise. Our protocols don't account for any of that. We are executing correct procedures in the wrong sequence for the wrong environment. And because the procedures themselves are medically sound, no one has stopped to question the sequence. He looked out the window. The courthouse was gone. Atlanta was spread below them, organized and accidental at the same time. You know about Harrow, he said. Not a question. I know everything about Harrow, Diana said. I know what the incident report on file says. I also know that the report does not match the medication order timestamps that a third party obtained through a data access request 18 months ago. She met his eyes. I know you signed a confidentiality agreement that has prevented you from defending yourself in any form. I know you have been running a community clinic on Farwell Avenue for 6 years, and I know you lost that clinic this morning because it was included in your divorce settlement. A pause. I did not come to that courthouse because you are a man with nothing to lose. I came because you are the most qualified person I could find, and because I believe the record on you is wrong. He was quiet for a long moment. What exactly are you asking me to do? Redesign our in-flight emergency protocols from the ground up. Work with my team. Observe, assess, rebuild. She did not look away. And if we find what I believe we will find in those old Harrow files, we deal with that too. He looked at his hands, the hands that had been accused of killing a man, the hands that had spent the last 6 years doing nothing more complex than suturing minor lacerations and checking blood pressure readings on Farwell Avenue. I'm not making any promises about what I'll find, he said. Neither am I, Diana said. That's why I need someone honest. The helicopter banked south, and Aldrich Webb, for the first time in 9 years, did not look away from where he was going. Aldrich Webb had grown up on the south side of Atlanta, in a neighborhood that the city's promotional materials had stopped mentioning sometime in the late 90s and hadn't found reason to revisit. His father drove long-haul freight. His mother taught 3rd grade at an elementary school 2 blocks from their house and brought her students' drawings home and taped them to the refrigerator because she said a child's drawing on a refrigerator was the surest sign a house was still alive. He had been a serious child. Not grim, not joyless, focused. The kind of child who finds something and holds on to it until he understands it completely before moving to the next thing. He found medicine at 14 in a high school biology class that covered the circulatory system in a way that made something click behind his eyes that had never clicked before. The idea that the body was a system, that systems had logic, that logic once understood could be applied, that applying it correctly could mean the difference between a person living and dying. He was not romantic about it, not drawn to the idea of being a healer in any mystical sense. He was drawn to the precision, the stakes, the way that medicine at its best was the most consequential application of careful thinking that a human being could perform. He got to Graymont Medical School on a full scholarship, and 2 part-time jobs, and the kind of relentless focus that leaves very little room for much else. He married Simone in his 3rd year of residency. She was finishing a business administration degree and had a laugh that rearranged rooms and an energy that he had found in those early years genuinely magnetic. Nadia was born 2 years later. For a while, the life he had built felt like something real, something that was going to hold. Then came the night of March 14th. The patient's name was Harold Bird, 47 years old, construction foreman, brought into Harrow Hospital on a stretcher at 9:22 in the evening after a workplace accident had introduced a falling steel beam to his midsection in a way his body was not designed to accommodate. Severe internal bleeding, multiple organ involvement. The kind of case that got paged to Aldrich because the residents on call that night had looked at each other and silently agreed this particular situation required someone who had been there before. Aldrich had been there before. He scrubbed in at 9:47. The OR was already in motion around him. His team, his people, the scrub nurse, the circulating nurse, the first-year resident there to watch and learn and try not to let her face show what her nervous system was doing. He looked at the vitals, looked at the imaging, made his assessment, and began. For the first 90 minutes, the surgery went the way surgery goes when the surgeon knows what he is doing, and the team has worked together long enough to function like a single organism. Efficient, calibrated, not easy, controlled. Then at 11:47 in the evening, Harold Bird's blood pressure dropped in a way that changed the calculation entirely. Aldrich looked at the numbers, looked at the tissue, looked at the blood panel that had come back 20 minutes earlier. He made a decision. He called for a specific anticoagulant. The decision was built on 3 converging data points and 9 years of surgical experience, and the kind of certainty that comes not from confidence, but from comprehension. He administered the medication. He continued. Harold Bird died on the table at 12:51 in the morning. Not because of the medication Aldrich had ordered, because the internal damage was extensive, and the body after a certain point runs out of ways to compensate. Because sometimes a person comes in hurt badly enough that the best surgical team in the state cannot change the outcome. Because medicine is not magic. Aldrich called the time of death, removed his gloves, and stood in the scrub room afterward looking at the wall. He had lost patients before. Not many, but some. Each time it left the same residue. Not guilt exactly. Not failure. Something harder to name. The weight of having been in the room when a life ended and being unable to say with certainty whether anything could have changed it. He went home at 2 in the morning. He was back at 7:30. The chief of medicine called him in before rounds. The incident report had been filed. Aldrich read it standing at the desk while the chief watched him with the expression of a man who had been in this room before and did not enjoy it. The report said Aldrich had ordered the wrong anticoagulant protocol. It said he had proceeded against explicit warnings from the surgical team. It said his clinical judgment had been compromised in ways the report did not specify beyond that phrase. He read it again. Then he set it down very carefully. "This is not what happened," he said. "The matter is under internal review," the chief said. "I would like to see the original medication log, the time-stamped order records, the anesthesiologist's documented notes. That's not how the review process works. I understand that. I would like to see the records." A pause. "The matter is under internal review," the chief said again. 14 days later, Aldrich was called back. A different document waited on the desk. A mutual separation agreement. A confidentiality clause covering the circumstances of his departure and any related clinical events from the preceding 60 days. A deadline, 48 hours to sign. If he declined, the hospital would pursue formal disciplinary action and refer the matter to the state medical board. He sat with that for a long time. He had a wife. He had a daughter who was 2 years old and had learned to say his name 6 weeks ago and said it approximately 40 times a day in the wondering tone of someone who could not quite believe this particular person belonged to her. He had no proof. He signed. He left Harrow on a Thursday afternoon with a box of personal items and the agreement in his pocket and a question settling into him like weather settling into a season. Had he made a mistake? He did not believe he had. He knew what he had ordered. He knew why. He knew the logic of the decision and the data that supported it, and the way the decision had felt in the moment, not like uncertainty, but like clarity. But the report said otherwise. And the report was the record. And he had signed an agreement that prevented him from disputing that record in any forum, public or private. So the question had no answer, and it lived in him quietly for 9 years. But underneath the question about the medicine, underneath the question about the outcome, there was always a harder question he had never allowed himself to follow all the way to the end. Not whether he had made a mistake, but whether someone had decided very deliberately to say that he had. He had never followed that question to its conclusion. He had been afraid of what he might find there. He opened the clinic on Farwell Avenue 3 years after leaving Harrove, once he had saved enough working in smaller private practices to afford the lease and the equipment. No surgical suite, no complex cases. Basic care for the people the hospital system had decided weren't profitable enough to fully serve. Hypertension checks, wound care, diabetes management, prenatal guidance for women who couldn't afford the downtown clinics. It wasn't what he had trained for, but it was something. It was the only form of medicine he still trusted himself to practice. Then the marriage started to end. It had been ending for a while before either of them said so directly. Simone had wanted more than the clinic, more than the Southside apartment and the modest income, and the man who came home tired and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a silence she had at some point stopped trying to fill. He did not blame her entirely. He understood the distance. He just couldn't close it. The divorce took 18 months, not bitter in the theatrical sense. Methodical, strategic. Preston Lowe was very good at methodical and strategic. By the end, the clinic was gone. The savings were divided. The car was in Simone's name and stayed there. And on a Tuesday morning in October, a judge awarded Aldrich primary residential custody of his daughter, split the remaining assets, and closed the file, which was how he ended up on the courthouse steps with his hand in an empty pocket. The Ashford Air Medical Operations Center was 20 minutes outside the city. A low, wide building. Practical. 3 helicopter pads flanking the east side. A training hangar large enough to fit a full medical simulation unit with room to spare. The kind of facility that looked from the outside like a place where people came to work rather than to be seen working. Aldrich noticed that. It mattered. He showed up on his first morning in a collared shirt and dark pants with a legal pad and 2 pens. He had not owned a briefcase in years. He did not go out and buy one. Conrad Reese met him at the entrance. Conrad was 44, broad-shouldered. He moved through space with the deliberate economy of someone who had spent years in environments where unnecessary movement was a liability. He had been a field medic with the Army for 8 years before going back for his medical degree. He had been running Ashford Air's medical operations for 6. He had built the team himself, trained most of them himself, and the handshake he offered Aldrich at the entrance had the quality of a test rather than a greeting. "I want to be straight with you," Conrad said. They were walking the corridor toward the operations floor. He said it without preamble, the way he apparently said most things. "I think Ms. Ashford made this decision for reasons that have more to do with your story than your qualifications. A surgeon who gave up his license consulting on emergency protocols." "I didn't give up my license," Aldrich said. "I signed a separation agreement under duress and without access to my own records. The license itself was never formally revoked." Conrad looked at him. "Those are not the same outcome." "No," Aldrich said. "They are not." Conrad held that for a moment. Then he pushed open the door to the operations floor and didn't respond, which told Aldrich 2 things. First, Conrad was sharp enough to recognize the distinction even if he wasn't ready to accept it yet. Second, he was a man who let results settle arguments rather than words. That was a man Aldrich could work with. He spent the first week saying almost nothing. He sat in on simulation drills. He watched the team run mock trauma scenarios inside the helicopter training unit, a full-scale aircraft mock-up mounted on a hydraulic platform that could simulate flight movement turbulence and pressure variation. He observed the way the paramedics moved inside the simulated cabin, the way the physicians made decisions, the sequence in which they reached for equipment, the small hesitations that accumulated under the combined pressure of simulated movement and simulated urgency. He filled his legal pad with notes and kept them to himself. That evening, Aldrich drove back to the apartment he had been renting since March. Nadia was at the kitchen table when he walked in, sitting with one knee pulled up to her chest, in the specific way she had been sitting since she was 6 years old, and showed no signs of changing, working her way through a geography worksheet. She looked up when he came through the door. "How was it?" she asked. "Different," he said. "Good different." She considered this the way she considered most things, seriously, without rushing toward a verdict. Then she pointed at the map on the page in front of her. "Is that Iowa or Illinois?" Illinois is east of the river. Iowa is west. She wrote something down. Then, without looking up in the careful voice she used when she had been thinking about something for a while before deciding to say it. Dad, are we going to be okay? He looked at the side of her face, 11 years old, asking the questions adults avoid because the answers are complicated. Yes, he said. She kept writing. He sat at the kitchen table of his rented apartment, and in the quiet of that ordinary evening, he made a private promise to himself. He was going to figure out how to make that true. Not someday, not eventually. Starting now. Starting with the question he had been afraid to follow all the way to the end for 9 years. He was done being afraid of the answer. The first simulation run of the new framework happened on a Monday morning. Aldrich had spent the weekend at the kitchen table after Nadia went to sleep working through the legal pad page by page, translating observations into a structured proposal. Not editorializing, not dramatizing. Just the data, the comparison, and the conclusion the data produced. The way he had always worked. The way he had been trained to work before 9 years of running a community clinic had narrowed the scope of what he was allowed to apply that training to. What he had found during that first week was not a failure of skill. Every person on Conrad's team was competent. Several were exceptional. The problem was structural, and it was the same problem buried in every incident report dressed in different details. These were people executing correct medicine in the wrong order for the wrong room. The environment demanded a different sequence. Nobody had written that sequence yet. That was the work. The framework he proposed had 3 components. First, a risk classification protocol executed in the first 90 seconds of every flight before any intervention was initiated. Not a checklist. A decision tree built around the specific physiological variables that behave differently at altitude and under vibration. Blood pressure trajectory, oxygenation curve. The particular way that certain trauma presentations that looked stable on the ground became unstable in the air. Second, a reordering of intervention priorities for hemorrhagic trauma specifically. In a hospital, the standard sequence placed airway management first. In a moving helicopter with a patient in active blood loss, that sequence was wrong. Not because airway didn't matter, because blood pressure collapse in that environment happened faster than the standard protocol accounted for, and the window for effective hemorrhage control closed in minutes, rather than the relative comfort of a hospital's controlled setting. Third, a complete reorganization of the emergency supply bag. Right now, the bags were organized the way hospital crash carts were organized by category. Airway equipment together, cardiac equipment together, hemorrhage control together. In the back of a moving helicopter, that meant a clinician might need to reach past 6 items to get to the 7th using both hands while the aircraft moved beneath them. The new design had one organizing principle: sequential, single-hand access. The first thing you needed was at the top, the second thing directly beneath it, and so on. Logical in retrospect, invisible until someone sat with the problem long enough to actually see it. He presented it to Conrad on a Friday afternoon, walking through each component without rushing, without performing confidence he didn't need to perform. Conrad read the proposal the way he apparently read everything completely, without the performance of urgency going back to certain sections twice. When he finished, he looked up. "Run it in simulation," he said. Monday morning. The simulation ran for 4 hours. By the end of it, the average time to stabilization for a severe hemorrhage patient had dropped from 19 minutes to 7 minutes and 44 seconds. The team had not changed. The equipment had not changed. The training had not changed. Only the sequence. Conrad stood at the edge of the simulation bay and watched the final run all the way through without expression. When it was over, he stood there a moment longer. Then he walked over to Aldrich and said what needed to be said, not much, but precisely chosen the way this particular man chose his words. Then he walked back to his office, and Aldrich went back to his desk, and neither of them made anything more of it than it was. The work was real. The numbers said so. That was enough. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks later, that Aldrich found the file. He had been in the records room at the back of the operations center for 2 hours, cross-referencing incident reports with medication logs, the way he used to cross-reference lab results with clinical presentations back at Harrove, looking for patterns, looking for the shape of the problem underneath the individual cases. Most of what he found was ordinary. Documentation delays, transcription errors, the normal noise of a high-pressure environment where people are trying to save lives and paperwork is the thing that happens after. Then he pulled case number 7-114, patient 52 years old, farming accident, severe blood loss, transported by Ashford Air from a rural county 60 miles south of Atlanta, died en route. The incident report listed cause of death as delayed clotting response following standard hemorrhage intervention. He looked at the medication log. Then he looked at it again. A critical clotting agent, the one that should have been administered within the first 4 minutes of a hemorrhage of this severity, was logged as not administered. Equipment unavailable at point of critical need. He set that page down. He picked up the secondary documentation. In the back of the file, tucked behind 3 pages of transport data and a copy of the patient intake form, was a handwritten field note. The paramedic's own record. The kind of documentation that gets written on a knee in the back of a moving aircraft and stuffed into a folder because there is no better option in that moment. The handwriting was compressed and slightly uneven. The handwriting of someone writing fast in a space that was moving beneath them. It said clotting agent drawn and readied at T+3, administered per protocol, patient response inconsistent with expected mechanism. He read it twice. Administered per protocol. The typed log said not administered. The handwritten note said administered per protocol. Same patient, same flight, same medication. 2 records, 2 different realities. Aldrich sat with that for a long time. And the thing that made something shift in him quietly, the way ice moves when the temperature changes, not dramatic, not sudden, but irreversible, was that he had seen this before. Not in someone else's file, not in a case study, not in a training manual. In his own case. 9 years ago. A typed record that said one thing. His own knowledge of what had actually happened saying something else entirely. The record winning. His knowledge losing. Him signing an agreement that prevented him from ever saying otherwise. He picked up the file, walked to the elevator, rode it to the 4th floor where Diana Ashford's office occupied the corner with windows facing the helicopter pads. He knocked once and opened the door. She looked up. He set his phone on her desk, both documents scanned and open on the screen. The typed medication log and the handwritten field note side by side. She read them the way she read everything. Completely. Without the performance of urgency, which was its own kind of urgency. 4 minutes, maybe 5. Then she looked up at him. I want the raw system logs from Harrow, he said. Not the incident report. Not the summary document. The original digital records. Timestamps, user access history. Every entry made to Harold Bird's file from the moment he was admitted to the moment I walked out of that building. She held his gaze. You think the file was altered? I think the file I was shown 9 years ago does not reflect what actually happened in that operating room. He did not look away. And I think the pattern I just found in your case files looks exactly like the pattern that ended my career. Diana looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up her phone. She made the calls that evening. Aldrich didn't hear them. He was in the parking lot, sitting in the car he had borrowed from Conrad, a detail that would have been almost funny under different circumstances. He was looking at the Atlanta skyline going orange and gray at the edges and thinking about Harold Bird, 47 years old, construction foreman, a man who had come into Harrow on a stretcher on a March night and had not walked out. Somewhere in the data trail of that night, there was either evidence that Aldrich had failed him or evidence that someone else had decided to say that he had. He did not know yet which one it was, but he was going to find out. The forensic data recovery firm Diana retained had a one-word name and an office in a building that did not advertise what happened inside it. 4 days later, the restored Harrow system logs were on Aldrich's desk. He waited until after 7 in the evening, until the operations center had gone quiet around him, until Conrad had left and the administrative staff had filtered out, and the only sounds were the HVAC system and the distant rotation of helicopter rotors on the pads outside, being run through their nightly check. Then he sat down and opened the file. He read slowly. He was not looking for confirmation of what he already believed. That was not how he had been trained to read data. You read data without a conclusion waiting at the end. You read it the way you read a patient openly without deciding what you were going to find before you found it. The medication order for the anticoagulant he had called for during Harold Bird's surgery appeared in the original order log at 11:47 in the evening. His name, his access credentials, the exact medication, the exact dosage, time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. He had ordered it. It was there in the original record exactly as he had always known it to be. He kept reading. At 3:14 in the morning, 2 hours and 23 minutes after Harold Bird had been pronounced dead, 2 hours and 23 minutes after Aldrich had removed his gloves and stood in the scrub room and looked at the wall, 2 hours and 23 minutes after the case was closed and the room had been cleared, and Aldrich had driven home through empty streets, the same entry had been modified. Order status changed from administered to not indicated. He looked at the modification record. The change had been made from an administrative account, not a physician's account, not a nurse's workstation, not any clinical terminal in any part of the hospital that had legitimate access to a patient's medication orders at any hour. An administrative account registered to Harrow's Operations Management Division. Back office, scheduling, facilities coordination. The kind of account that handled room assignments and vendor contracts and had no reason, no legitimate, conceivable, defensible reason to touch a surgical medication record. Ever. Let alone at 3:14 in the morning. Let alone on a chart belonging to a man who had been dead for over 2 hours. Aldrich set the file down on the desk. He did not move for a long time. Outside, a helicopter lifted off from pad 2. The sound built and then receded into the dark. And in the silence after it, he sat with what he was looking at. 9 years. 9 years of waking at 4 in the morning with a question pressing on him from the inside. 9 years of the clinic on Farwell Avenue and the careful, modest work that was the only work he still believed he was safe to do. 9 years of a marriage slowly losing pressure like a tire with a slow leak, not blowing out, just getting flatter. Until one morning you notice the ride has changed, and it has been changing for longer than you realized. He had not made a mistake. Not on the night of March 14th, not in the operating room, not in the decision that the report had described as compromised judgment. He had made the right call in a room where the call mattered and the patient had died anyway. Because sometimes patients die anyway. Because the body reaches a point where no intervention changes what is coming. Someone had sat at a computer at 3:14 in the morning and reached into a dead man's chart and changed the record to say otherwise. Deliberately. With a specific account. At a specific time. While Aldrich was at home asleep, not yet knowing that by the time he woke up, the story of what had happened in that OR would already have been rewritten without him. He was not returning to Harrow to vindicate himself in any formal sense. He was interested in who had done this and why, and whether the thread he had found in case 7-114 connected to the same hand that had reached into his own records 9 years ago. He thought it did. He could not yet prove it. But in surgery, when you see the same presentation twice, you do not assume coincidence. You start looking for the underlying condition. Simone called on a Tuesday evening 4 days after he had delivered the Harrow vlogs to Diana's desk. Aldrich was at the kitchen counter when his phone buzzed. Nadia sat at the table across from him, reading, one knee pulled up to her chest. The same position she had held since she was 6 years old and showed no signs of changing. He stepped into the hallway and answered. "I've been thinking about Nadia," Simone said. Her voice was measured, careful. The voice she used when she wanted something but had decided the wanting should not be visible. About the current arrangement, whether it's really working for her. "The arrangement is working fine," Aldrich said. "She's doing well in school, she's adjusted. She's with you full-time, Aldrich. That's a significant amount of pressure on a single parent, especially with everything going on right now with your new position." "Say what you mean," he said. Silence, the silence of a person recalculating. "I just think we should revisit things," she said finally, "given the changes in your situation. My situation hasn't changed enough to give you what you're looking for. And I think you know that." He kept his voice level, not cold, level. "You left," he said. "That's done. But if you want to be part of Nadia's life, her actual life, not a custody structure that works for you, that conversation starts with honesty, not strategy." Simone's voice cooled. "I could discuss this with Preston." "That's your choice," Aldrich said. "But before you do, ask yourself whether Preston Lowe has ever given you advice that wasn't also useful for Preston." He ended the call, stood in the hallway for a moment, then he walked back to the kitchen. Nadia looked up from her book. She studied him the way she studied most things that mattered completely without performance. Then she looked back down at the page. That quiet measuring look was its own kind of question, and he understood it the same way he understood most things she didn't say directly. She was tracking something. She had been tracking it for a while. He sat down across from her, and they stayed like that in the kitchen's quiet, the refrigerator humming the city doing whatever the city does at 8 in the evening, and Aldrich Webb understood with the particular clarity that comes at still moments what he was fighting for. Not his reputation, not his license, not the satisfaction of being declared correct. He was fighting for the version of the future where Nadia grew up knowing that the truth was worth following to the end, even when the end was long and the road to it was hard. That was the only inheritance that mattered, the only thing Preston Lowe could not reach. He found the hemostatic agent problem on a Wednesday. Routine. He had not been looking for it specifically. He had been doing what he had been hired to do, reviewing supply chain documentation as part of the broader protocol assessment, checking that the equipment specified in the new procedures was the equipment actually loaded into the flight kits. Most of it checked out. Then he got to the hemostatic agents. The current supply, a batch integrated into the flight kits 6 weeks earlier, had come through a procurement channel he did not recognize. Not the standard vendor Ashford Air had used for the previous 3 years. A new supplier listed on the purchase order as Vertex Clinical Partners. He had not heard of Vertex Clinical Partners. That was not by itself alarming. Supply chains shifted, vendors changed, but he pulled the certification data and then he pulled the stability studies. And then he sat at his desk for 45 minutes reading through the stability studies very carefully. The compound's clotting performance was sound under standard laboratory conditions. Room temperature, stable surface, the conditions under which the certification testing had been conducted. All of it exactly as advertised. But the stability data also included a footnote buried small, the kind of notation that gets skipped on a first pass and a second pass, and possibly a third about performance degradation under combined stresses. Sustained mechanical vibration above a specific frequency threshold. Ambient temperature variation exceeding a certain range across the duration of exposure. He looked at the frequency threshold. Then he looked at the vibration profile of an Ashford Air helicopter at cruising altitude, which was in the operational data he had been reviewing for weeks. Then he looked at the temperature variation data from Ashford Air's own flight logs, which showed an average ambient range in the patient compartment during extended transport of 21 degrees across the duration of a standard flight. He put those 3 things together. In a hospital, this compound worked. In a controlled environment with stable conditions and predictable temperature, it did exactly what the certification said it did. In the back of a helicopter flying 200 miles over open terrain in variable weather, the compound degraded. Not catastrophically. Not in a way that would be obvious on the ground, or in a short transport, or in conditions that stayed within the testing parameters. But in the long hauls in the flights to the rural counties, where the distance was the entire point in exactly the situations Ashford Air was built to handle, it became unreliable. And unreliable in a hemorrhage scenario was the same as wrong. He wrote up the full analysis that afternoon. No editorializing, no language designed to alarm. Just the data, the comparison, and the conclusion the data produced. He took it to Diana's office and walked her through it. She read it twice. "Pull it," she said. "Today." "Today," he agreed. He went back to his office, and for about 4 hours, he believed the problem was solved. That the bad supply would be replaced, the kits would be rebuilt with a certified alternative, and the demonstration scheduled 11 days out would proceed on solid ground. He was wrong. The board meeting was the next afternoon. Aldrich had been in rooms like this before. Rooms where the decision had already been made before anyone sat down, and the conversations existed to give the decision the appearance of having been reached together. He knew the architecture of those rooms, the way certain people positioned their chairs, the way language tilted toward outcomes rather than processes. This was one of those rooms. 7 board members. 3 of them had been briefed before the meeting on the demonstration timeline and the contract value attached to it, a federal service agreement, 7 years expanded coverage across 4 additional states. The dollar figure was the kind of number that changes a company's trajectory, the kind of number that once it enters a conversation starts doing its own talking. Pulling and replacing the hemostatic supply at this stage, 2 of the 3 brief members explained would require resubmitting portions of the equipment certification package to the federal oversight body, which could mean delays of several weeks, which could invalidate the current approval window entirely, which could mean the contract went to someone else. Douglas Farr said it plainly. Farr was the kind of man who valued directness the way some people value furniture functionally and only up to the point where it became inconvenient. The agent is certified. The risk assessment has been conducted. I see no basis for pulling a certified product 11 days before a federal demonstration on the strength of an internal analysis prepared by a consultant with a contested professional history. Aldrich looked at him across the table. The certification was conducted in a ground laboratory under standard conditions. I'm telling you what happens to this compound in actual flight. That is not opinion. The stability data is in the report. The certification body reviewed the stability data, Farr said. They approved the product. The certification body did not test it at the vibration frequency and temperature variation of a 200-mile rural transport. That combination was not in the testing parameters. Farr looked at him steadily. You are a consultant with a contested professional history. Just that. Just that sentence placed on the table like a card being played. Aldrich looked at the card, recognized what it was, said nothing because there was nothing to say that would move Douglas Farr. And Aldrich Webb had not spent 9 years in the wreckage of a record used against him to come here and let a different record be used against him in a different room. He was not going to lose his composure. He was not going to perform. He was going to remember this moment very carefully. Diana overruled the board on the pull. That part she had authority to do. But the replacement supply could not be sourced and certified inside 11 days. No one could move that fast through the federal certification process. The compromise was the worst version of a compromise because it was not really a compromise at all. Keep the flag product in the kits for the demonstration. Flag it for post-demonstration replacement. Proceed as planned. Aldrich said no. He did not have a vote. He said no anyway. Then he walked out of that meeting and stood in the corridor and looked at the wall and breathed, not to calm himself, but to measure himself to verify that he was still the person he had been in that room, and not the version of himself who had signed things in offices because he had nowhere else to go. He was still that person. But he was also standing 11 days away from watching something preventable happen because the people with the authority to prevent it had decided not to. He could not stop it. Not yet. Not from where he was standing. But he was already thinking about where he needed to stand next. The demonstration was on a Thursday. Clear sky. October doing what October sometimes does in Georgia, behaving like summer had agreed to let someone else try for a while. The training facility had been arranged the way federal demonstrations are arranged, with the self-consciousness of an institution that knows it is being evaluated and has organized everything to communicate that it knows how to be evaluated. Observers in a glass enclosure overlooking the field. Representatives from the Department of Health and Human Services. 2 regional emergency management directors. The full Ashford Air Board. A pool of credentialed press. Aldrich stood at the field perimeter with Conrad. They had not talked much about what was in the flight kits. Aldrich had told Conrad what he had found and what the board had decided. Conrad had looked at him for a moment, then looked at the helicopter pads and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The simulation began. Multi-patient mass casualty event, various injury profiles, triage loading in-flight treatment while the ground team managed the scene. The design of the scenario was built to stress test both the protocol and the team at the same time. For the first 40 minutes, it was the clearest argument Aldrich could have made for his own work. The revised protocol ran cleanly. The team moved through triage at a pace that drew audible reactions from the observation enclosure above. A pediatric trauma scenario, historically the weakest point in the old protocol, where the sequence tended to break down under the added pressure of a smaller patient and different physiological parameters, was handled in under 8 minutes, from the moment the helicopter touched down to the moment the simulated patient was stabilized. Conrad said nothing beside him. He didn't need to. Then the hemorrhage scenario began. Simulated patient, severe abdominal trauma, active blood loss. The flight medic reached into the kit and initiated the hemostatic intervention according to protocol. The sequence was correct. The dosage was correct. The timing was correct. Every decision the medic made was the right decision based on the best available information. 90 seconds in the biological test model, a standardized tissue analog used for high-fidelity training simulations, began showing signs of abnormal coagulation response, clotting occurring in the wrong tissue zone, diffuse rather than targeted, not what the compound's mechanism was designed to produce. Exactly the pattern Aldrich had predicted based on the stability data, based on the vibration profile, based on the temperature logs, based on 45 minutes of reading a footnote that no one before him had apparently read all the way to the end. The lead physician on the scenario looked at the readings, looked at the tissue model, called a halt. The field went quiet. Not the quiet of a pause, the quiet of a thing going wrong in front of people who were paid to assess whether things went wrong. Aldrich stood at the perimeter. He had told them. He had shown them the data and written the analysis and presented it in the board meeting and said this would happen and been told he was a consultant with a contested professional history, and the demonstration was 11 days away and the contract was worth what it was worth. He stood there and felt the particular stillness of a man watching something preventable occur, because the people with the power to prevent it had decided the prevention was too expensive. It was not the first time he had felt this. It might not be the last. But he was still standing, and he was not signing anything. By 6 in the evening, 2 regional health industry publications had run the story. He read it on his phone in the parking lot, sitting in Conrad's borrowed car again, because that had apparently become the place where the significant things found him. The story named him. Of course it did. Aldrich Webb, former surgical attending at Harrow Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. Patient death, license surrender. And now the consultant behind the flawed protocol that had failed in front of federal observers at Ashford Air Medical's demonstration for a major government contract. Discredited, the story called him. Not alleged, not reportedly. Discredited. He read it twice. Then he focused on the logistics. The demonstration had ended at 12:40 in the afternoon. The story had published at 6:02 in the evening. 6 hours. Specifically fast, given that the information in the story was not available from the observer enclosure. Equipment names, the exact nature of the coagulation failure, internal timeline data that had not been released through any official channel, the kind of detail you know if you were inside that building, working the case with access to the operations data in real time. Whoever had given the reporter what they needed to write this story had been inside that building and had transmitted the information within hours of the demonstration ending. That was not a journalist doing good work. That was a pipeline. Someone had set it up in advance, had been waiting for the failure, had been ready to move the moment it happened, which meant they had known the failure was coming, which meant they had known what was in those kits. Aldrich sat in the car and looked at the Atlanta skyline going dark at the edges and thought about Preston Lowe standing on the courthouse steps that morning weeks ago. The leather portfolio, the phone, the face that had gone carefully neutral when Diana Ashford's helicopter touched down on the courthouse lawn. Not surprised, not curious. The deliberate flatness of a man who was managing information he already possessed, who had run the calculation before arriving at the courthouse, and was watching the first variable confirm itself right on schedule. Aldrich had seen that expression in that moment and filed it away without knowing exactly why. He knew why now. The midsection of a plan he hadn't fully seen yet had just shown itself. He drove home, radio off. After Nadia was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she did her homework and had strong opinions about state capitals, where he had eaten alone for months, learning the specific skills of a life that had contracted all at once. He pulled a sheet of plain white paper from the printer on the counter. Not the legal pad he used at work, a blank white page. He wrote in 2 columns. Left column, what he knew. The Harrow medication log had been modified at 3:14 in the morning by an administrative account with no clinical access. That modification had changed his documented order status from administered to not indicated, which had become the foundation of the incident report, which had become the foundation of the separation agreement, which had become 9 years of silence. The hemostatic supply in Ashford Air's current flight kits had been sourced through a procurement channel that bypassed standard vendor approval. The vendor was Vertex Clinical Partners. Nobody at Ashford Air recognized the origin of that name. The press story had published 6 hours after the demonstration ended with internal operational data, which required a source inside the building with advanced knowledge of the failure. Preston Lowe had been outside counsel for a pharmaceutical distribution group for 11 years. That fact was in a discovery document from his own divorce proceedings. Preston Lowe had been on the courthouse steps when Diana's helicopter arrived. His face had gone neutral, not managing new information, managing information he already had. Right column, what he didn't have yet. The name attached to the administrative account that modified Harold Bird's record at 3:14 in the morning. A provable legal connection between Preston Lowe and Vertex Clinical Partners. The identity of the press source. He stared at both columns for a long time. Then he opened his phone. He scrolled to a number he had not called in 9 years, had kept in his contacts without fully understanding why, had looked at occasionally in the early years, and then stopped looking at because looking at it made the question feel closer than he could manage at the time. The name was Ruth Danvers. She had been the charge nurse on the surgical floor at Harrove Hospital the night Harold Bird died. She had worked alongside Aldrich for 3 years before that night, long enough that he knew she took her coffee black with one sugar and kept a photograph of her niece taped to the inside of her locker, and did her job with a steady, unshowy precision that he had always trusted, the way you trust someone who has never given you a reason not to. 2 weeks after he signed the separation agreement and left Harrove, a text had arrived from a number he didn't recognize. It said, "I know you didn't do what they said. I'm sorry, I can't say more right now." He had saved the number. He had figured out whose it was. He had never called back because calling back meant opening something he wasn't sure he had the ground beneath him to open. He pressed call. She picked up on the third ring. "I wondered," she said. Her voice was older, not fragile, just older in the way voices get when years have moved through them and left something settled behind. "I always wondered if you'd call." "I need to ask you something," Aldrich said, "and I need you to tell me the truth, whatever it costs. Because what I'm about to tell you means this is already past the point where either of us staying quiet does anything useful." He told her everything: the restored Harrove logs, the 314 modification, the administrative account, Ashford Air, case 7-114, and the handwritten field note against the typed record, Vertex Clinical Partners, the demonstration, the press story with internal data published 6 hours after the failure. He laid it out the way he laid out findings in sequence, without dramatizing it, because the facts assembled in order were dramatic enough on their own. When he finished, the line was quiet for a moment, just the sound of two people on either end of 9 years of silence. Then Ruth Danvers said 4 words: "I kept a copy." Aldrich went very still. "Of what?" he said. Not a question. A breath held in place. "The access log from that night," she said. "The floor system ran automated backup logs every 4 hours. It was an old protocol. Most of the staff didn't even know it was still running by then. I pulled the 4 a.m. printout before anyone came around to ask what had been printed." A pause long enough that he could hear her deciding something. "I've had it in a safety deposit box since that March. I didn't know what to do with it. I had a daughter in middle school, a mortgage, no lawyer, no one I could trust to know what the right move was." Another pause. "I told myself I'd find the right moment." "The right moment," Aldrich said quietly, "is right now." A beat. "I know it is," she said. "I've known for a while now." He was already reaching for his jacket before she finished speaking. Ruth did not wait until morning. She did not ask whether it could keep. She drove to the bank that same evening, opened the safety deposit box she had been maintaining for 9 years, and photographed every page of the access log under the fluorescent light of the bank's back room. She sent the scans before she got back to her car. The kind of woman who had held something carefully for a long time, and when the moment came to release it, did not hesitate. He was at Diana's office at 7 the next morning. Not 7:30. 7. He had been awake since 4, not restless, not anxious, just awake in the way you are awake when something has shifted and sleep no longer has a claim on you, because the thing that needed doing had declared itself and was waiting. Diana was already in her office when he arrived. Coffee on her desk, a legal pad with notes in her compressed handwriting, the alertness behind her eyes of someone who had not slept well because she had been running calculations instead. He set his phone on her desk. The scanned access log was open on the screen. She read it the way she read everything, completely, without the performance of urgency. 4 minutes, maybe 5. She turned the phone slightly once to see a section more clearly. Then she set it down. "This is the modification," she said. 3:14 in the morning, he said. "Administrative account, Operations Management Division. No clinical access, no documented reason to be in that record at any hour. And this is 9 years old, preserved on a floor backup log that an automated system generated at 4 a.m. before anyone thought about what had been printed." Diana looked at the document again, not because she had missed something, because she was making a decision and was verifying, as she always did, that the decision she was about to make was the one she actually meant. "Pull it all," she said. He said nothing. He had already said pull it. Once was enough between people who communicated clearly. The Ashford Air legal team worked for 72 hours. They started with Vertex Clinical Partners. Delaware registration. Incorporation date 4 years ago. Registered agent listed as a law firm with offices in Atlanta and Birmingham. Small discreet, the kind of practice that did corporate formation work for clients who preferred the work not call attention to itself. They pulled the law firm's client relationships through disclosure filings and retainer agreements in the public record. The law firm had among its clients a pharmaceutical distribution group operating across the southeastern United States. Midsize, regional. The kind of company that moved product between manufacturers and hospital systems and did very well in the space between. That pharmaceutical distribution group had retained Preston Lowe as outside counsel. For 11 years. Aldrich read that sentence 3 times when they put it in front of him. Preston Lowe, the man in the charcoal suit on the courthouse steps, the man whose expression had gone carefully neutral when Diana's helicopter touched down on the courthouse lawn. The man who had structured the divorce settlement with a precision that Aldrich now understood had been operating from a more complete map of the territory than his client had ever seen. Outside counsel, 11 years, for a pharmaceutical distribution company that had, through a registered agent, through a small discreet law firm, through a Delaware entity incorporated 4 years ago, supplied Ashford Air Medical with a hemostatic agent that performed exactly as Aldrich had described. It would perform degrading under vibration and heat in a helicopter on the day of a federal demonstration. 6 hours before a story ran naming Aldrich Webb as a discredited consultant responsible for a failed protocol. And then the legal team went deeper. 9 years ago, in the months leading up to the night of March 14th, Preston Lowe had been lead counsel for a pharmaceutical group preparing to launch a new anticoagulant therapy into the surgical market. High cost, high margin. The kind of drug that generates significant and sustained revenue if it becomes the standard of care across a region's surgical centers. The kind of launch that requires a clear runway. No competing approaches, no protocol changes at the hospital level that would redirect clinical decision-making away from the new product. Aldrich had been in those same months developing and presenting a protocol within Harrow's surgical department, a systematic approach to managing complex hemorrhage cases. Evidence-based, designed to reduce unnecessary pharmacological intervention and concentrate treatment where it was most needed. The kind of protocol that, if adopted as a regional standard across surgical centers in Georgia and Alabama, would have significantly reduced the patient population for whom the new anticoagulant therapy would be prescribed. Not because the drug was bad medicine, because Aldrich's protocol was better medicine for a specific category of patient. And better medicine in that specific category meant fewer prescriptions. Fewer prescriptions meant a smaller market. A smaller market meant a worse launch. A worse launch meant a worse return on 9 years of development and the significant capital that had backed it. Preston Lowe had not been hired to destroy Aldrich Webb. He had been hired to protect a product launch. Aldrich Webb, from the perspective of that calculation, was a line item, a source of risk, a protocol being presented in department meetings at a major hospital that, if it took hold, would cost someone a great deal of money. The mechanism for neutralizing that risk was already there, built into the institutional structure of Harrow Hospital. A death on the operating table. A record that could be modified from an administrative account in the middle of the night. An incident report drafted to produce a specific outcome rather than document what had actually occurred. A separation agreement with a confidentiality clause. And Aldrich Webb, 48 hours after Harold Bird was pronounced dead, signing his own silence because he had a 2-year-old daughter and no proof and nowhere else to turn. The mechanism was clean, quiet, entirely deniable, and it had worked for 9 years. Then Diana Ashford had landed a helicopter on a courthouse lawn, and it had started to come apart. The U.S. Attorney's Office received the full evidence package on a Monday morning. Diana went herself. She did not send the legal team alone. She walked into the federal building in downtown Atlanta with the documentation in a folder and her attorneys at her side and the composure of a woman who had built something real, watched someone try to take it apart from the inside, and was now placing the evidence of that attempt on a federal desk. Ruth Danvers was contacted by federal investigators the following week. She texted Aldrich about it in the brief, direct way she communicated most things, 2 words sent one after the other. Confirmed. Ready. He called her back that evening. She answered on the second ring. They did not talk long. There was not much left that needed saying. What Ruth had done, driving to that bank, opening that box, standing under fluorescent light, photographing each page that had said the important thing already. He told her so. She said something that was not quite an acceptance and not quite a deflection. Something in between that told him she had been carrying the weight of that safety deposit box for a long time and was only now beginning to set it down. Preston Lowe was indicted on a Thursday morning, 11 weeks after the board meeting at Ashford Air. Wire fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to falsify medical records, 3 counts, federal charges. Aldrich read the press release once on his phone in the operations center between a training review and a meeting with the rescheduled demonstration planning team. He read it the way you read something you have been waiting for long enough that by the time it arrives, it feels less like relief and more like the closing of an account that had been running too long. He did not feel triumphant. What he felt instead was quiet. Good quiet. The quiet of a room after something loud has been going on for a very long time and has finally stopped. Not emptiness, resolution, the kind of stillness that has something solid at its center. He went back to the training review. Douglas Farr resigned from the board before the formal meeting convened. Not after. Before. His resignation letter arrived at Diana's office at 7 in the morning. 2 paragraphs, no explanation. The letter of a man who could read where something was going and had decided not to be present when it arrived. Harrow Hospital issued its formal statement 6 weeks after the indictment. 2 paragraphs. The hospital acknowledged that the incident report filed following the death of Harold Bird had contained inaccuracies that did not reflect the documented clinical record. It acknowledged that modifications made to the original medication order log had not been the work of the attending surgical physician. It stated clearly that Dr. Aldrich Webb bore no clinical responsibility for the death of Harold Bird. 2 paragraphs, 9 years. Aldrich read it on a Wednesday evening in his kitchen after Nadia had gone to bed. He read it sitting at the table under the overhead light with the apartment quiet around him. He read both paragraphs twice. Then he set his phone face down on the table and looked at the wall. He thought about Harold Bird the way he always thought about him, with the sorrow of someone who could not change what had happened and the clarity of someone who now knew it was not what the record had said it was. Both things at once, not resolved into something clean, just held together. The way you hold things too large to put down and too real to pretend away. Harold Bird had died on that table. That was true, had always been true, would remain true regardless of what any statement said. What the statement corrected was the story told about why. And the why had mattered to Aldrich's career and his marriage, and his 9 years of carrying a question without an answer had mattered to the 11 patients who had been transported in aircraft running protocols that should have been updated years ago, but hadn't been because the person who understood the problem had been removed from any room where he could raise it. The statement did not give those things back, but it gave the truth a place to live outside of him, and that he thought, sitting in the quiet of his kitchen with his phone face down on the table, that was not nothing. That was not a small thing. After 9 years, that was an enormous thing. Simone came on a Saturday morning 10 days before the Ashford Webb Center was scheduled to open. She did not call ahead. She did not text. She appeared at the door of his apartment at 9:15 in the morning, wearing a gray coat with her hands folded in front of her, and the expression of someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say, and then at the last moment decided not to use the rehearsal. Nadia was at a friend's house. The apartment was quiet. Aldrich opened the door, looked at her. A moment passed between them where neither of them said anything. "Come in," he said. She sat at the kitchen table and looked around the apartment with the careful expression of someone taking in information they have decided not to react to visibly. "I saw the news," she said, "about Preston." "I figured you had." She was quiet for a moment, long enough that the refrigerator's hum became something both of them could hear. "I knew he wasn't entirely honest," she said finally. "During the divorce, some of the things he told me about how to structure the settlement." She stopped. "I knew they were aggressive. I asked about some of it. Not enough. I didn't push because I wanted it to be over." A pause. She looked at her hands. "I wanted to be done with everything. The years after Harrow, the clinic, the way things had been between us. I told myself I was protecting myself." "You were," Aldrich said. She looked up. "That's not the same thing as being right," he said. She held that. "I know that." He looked at her without anger, not with the cold distance that had characterized most of their last 18 months together. with the clarity that comes when you have been through enough that the energy required to perform emotions you don't feel becomes too expensive to spend. You didn't leave because I was broken, he said. You left because leaving was easier than staying. And Preston made leaving very easy. He gave you a structure that made it feel clean. And you let him because the alternative was harder and you were tired. She didn't argue. She absorbed it in the way that told him she had been sitting with this version of the truth for a while before she came. Not defending herself, not looking for a different framing, just receiving it. I'm not here to ask you to forgive me, she said. I don't think I've earned that. No, he said. You haven't. The words landed plainly, not as weapons, as facts. The kind of facts that require something to say and something to hear and are necessary regardless. I want to be part of Nadia's life, Simone said. Her actual life. Not visits on a schedule, not calls that feel like checking a box. I want to be her mother in the way I should have been. Aldrich leaned back in his chair. He looked at her for a long moment, not calculating weighing. The way you weigh something when the decision matters and you want to make it correctly rather than quickly. He thought about Nadia, 11 years old, keeping a ledger somewhere watching adults with that quiet, measuring gaze. He thought about what it would cost his daughter to grow up with a mother who was present in name only. And he thought about what it would cost her to grow up without a mother who was genuinely trying. Those were not the same cost. And Nadia was the one who would pay whichever one it was. Then start with the truth, he said. Not with me, with her. She is going to ask you questions. She already asks me questions I don't always know how to answer. And she deserves honest answers, not a version of events shaped to protect you. The actual truth in whatever pieces she can hold at a time. He paused. If you can do that, then we build something that works for her. That is the only thing I am interested in. Simone's eyes were wet. She did not look away. Okay, she said quietly. It was not a reconciliation. It was not forgiveness, fully given or received. It was not the end of something or the beginning of something you could name with confidence yet. It was smaller than all of those things and possibly more durable than most of them. A door left open by a fraction enough for a child to walk through without having to choose between the two people who loved her most. Aldrich stood, walked to the kitchen counter, poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he had made at 7. He set one in front of Simone. They sat across from each other and talked about Nadia. Not about the settlement, not about Preston, not about Herove or the clinic, or the years that had gone the way they had gone. About Nadia, her homework, the geography worksheets, and her deeply held opinions about the injustice of memorizing state capitals when the internet existed. The soccer team she had joined in September, and her specific intensity about defensive positioning, which Aldrich said she had not inherited from him, and which Simone said was something that was almost a smile, and might have been a real one she absolutely had. It was not easy, but it was honest, and honest was where things that were real had to start. Conrad found him on the tarmac that evening after the building had mostly emptied out, and the last of the daylight was going orange over the tree line. Not in his office. Outside where Pad 2 sat quiet and dark, and the air had the particular stillness of a place built for noise that has gone temporarily still. Conrad walked over and stood next to him without saying anything for a moment, the way men stand together, when they have measured each other honestly and found the measurement fair and no longer need to prove anything. 7:44, Conrad said finally. 7:44, Aldrich agreed. Previous best under the old protocol was 16 minutes and change. He shook his head slightly. I looked it up after the first simulation. 16 minutes and change for years. We thought that was just how long it took. It wasn't, Aldrich said. We just didn't know to question it. Conrad looked at him steadily. The rescheduled demonstration is 6 weeks out. The protocol will be ready, Aldrich said. Conrad nodded once. Then he was quiet for a moment longer, looking at the dark pads, the empty sky above the tree line where a transport run had gone out an hour earlier and not yet come back. What I said to you on the first morning, he said. I remember it. I stand behind the reasoning, Conrad said. I don't stand behind the conclusion. That's fair, Aldrich said, because it was. Conrad had looked at the available information and drawn a logical conclusion. The information had been incomplete. That was not a character failure. That was the problem with making judgments in the absence of the full record, which was Aldrich thought the entire problem. The entire 9-year problem distilled into one sentence. They stood there a few minutes longer without talking. The sky finished going dark. A light came on in the operations center behind them. Somewhere to the north, the returning transport helicopter made itself audible as a low hum before it appeared as a shape over the trees. They watched it come in. The Ashford Webb Center opened on a Tuesday in late October. The ceremony was held on the tarmac outside the main training hangar. October in Atlanta behaving like October for once, clear and slightly cool in the way that feels like a courtesy after months of heat. The facility had been expanded over the past weeks. A second simulation hangar added, new communications equipment installed, a dedicated training wing for the rural county paramedic teams who would work alongside Ashford Air on the expanded federal coverage that the rescheduled demonstration had secured cleanly and without incident 3 weeks earlier. Diana spoke for 7 minutes. She spoke about the 11 patients who had not survived their transports. She named them not as statistics, not as data points, not as evidence in support of a larger argument, as people. She said the Ashford Webb Center existed because of them, and because of the obligation their deaths had created the obligation to understand what had failed and to build something that would not fail them again. She said Aldrich's name once briefly near the end. He had asked her to keep it brief. She had. Ruth Danvers stood in the crowd near the back. She had not announced she was coming. She had not asked to be introduced. She was simply there the way people are, there when they have waited a long time for a thing to be completed and want to see it completed with their own eyes. Aldrich found her across the crowd and nodded once. She nodded back. That was enough. It was more than enough. After the ceremony, after the attendees moved toward the hangar for the facility tour, and the conversations that happen at the end of official things, Aldrich walked to the edge of the tarmac. Nadia was already there. She had come with him that morning in the car asking questions the entire 40-minute drive about the helicopters, about the new protocol, about whether the expanded training wing had better snack options than the old break room, which she had visited once and found wanting. He had answered the questions in the order they arrived. She stood at the tarmac's edge now in the jacket that was still slightly too large for her, and that she continued to prefer for reasons she had not explained and he had not pushed. Her hands were in her pockets. Her head was tilted back watching one of the Ashford Air helicopters rise from Pad 3 on a routine transport run. The sound of it built then began to recede. "Is that one running your protocol?" she said. "All of them are," he said. She considered this with the gravity she brought to most things that mattered. All 31. All 31. She was quiet for a moment. The helicopter was getting smaller, moving north over the tree line. "How many people will it save?" "I don't know yet," he said. "That's not really an answer," she said. "Not unkind, just precise." "It's the honest one," he said. "We'll track the outcomes over time. Compare the numbers to what they were before. But right now today, I don't know the number." She looked at him sideways. "But you think it will save people?" "Yes," he said. "More than before. That's what I can say right now." She seemed to find this acceptable, if not entirely satisfying, which was approximately the right response, and told him not for the first time that she was going to be fine. Better than fine. She was going to be someone who demanded honest answers and recognized them when she got them, and knew the difference between honest and comfortable. That was everything. That was the whole thing. She leaned against his arm. Not a hug, not a gesture that required anything in return. Just the small, unconscious lean of a child who has decided the person next to her is a safe place to be. He put his hand on her shoulder and felt the particular lightness of it and the weight underneath that lightness. He thought about the version of himself who had stood on courthouse steps with his hand in an empty pocket, trying to remember how to breathe like a man who still had somewhere to be. He thought about Harold Bird, the way he always thought about Harold Bird, with sorrow that does not resolve, and the clarity that does not erase the sorrow, but sits alongside it, making it possible to carry without being crushed. He had not saved Harold Bird. He had tried, and the body had reached the point where trying was not enough. That was true and would always be true. What was also true was that someone had taken a real loss in a real operating room and turned it into a mechanism for destroying the person who had stood at that table and done everything right. And that truth had been waiting 9 years in a safety deposit box in the careful hands of a woman who hadn't known what else to do with it except keep it safe until the right person asked. A second helicopter became visible in the distance, moving north on a different vector. Different flight, Different crew, different patients somewhere in a rural county waiting for help that was on its way. Is that another one? Nadia asked. Transport run, he said. Somebody needed help out in the county. She watched it, getting smaller, getting quieter. Are they going to be okay? He looked at the sky above the tree line where the aircraft was becoming a shape, and then a sound, and then almost nothing. They have a better chance than they would have had last month, he said. She thought about that, processed it in the way she processed things that mattered completely without rushing toward a conclusion just because a conclusion was available. That's the honest answer, she said. That's the honest answer, he agreed. She leaned against him again, and he kept his hand on her shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a while. The helicopter moved north and grew smaller and crossed the tree line and disappeared. And out there in the air above the counties, where the roads were long and the hospitals were far, and the distance between a person and what came next was measured in minutes, that either held or didn't out there, something had changed. Not everything. Not the distance. Not the accidents that happened on back roads and in fields. Not the grief that followed. Not the families who would still sit in waiting rooms and hear news that changed their lives. But the 12 minutes in the air, the sequence of hands reaching for equipment, the protocol in the kit, the difference between 19 minutes and 7 minutes and 44 seconds, that had changed. That was real. That would be there tomorrow and the day after, and in the data they would track over the coming months, and in the outcomes that would be different from what they would have been. Aldrich Webb looked at the clear October sky above Atlanta and held his daughter's shoulder and understood in the quiet way that real things are understood, rather than announce that this was what beginning again looked like. Not fanfare, not a ceremony, though there had been one. Not a statement from a hospital, though that had come too. A helicopter in the air, a protocol in the kit, a child leaning against your arm with her hands in her pockets. And the work that had always been real even when the record said otherwise. The work that had been waiting patient preserved, certain that the moment would come. The work that was just beginning.